Okay. Thank you guys for your patience today, and also thank you for coming. Dr. Nichols is an associate professor in human development and family studies and the director of the Children's Media Lab. She is primarily interested in the interface between children's cognitive development and educational media, and how and whether those relations vary by important demographic and social indicators. Some of her recent projects and consultancies include Sesame Workshop, PBS Kids, CTV, Between the Lions, WGBH Public TV, Sprout, Leapfrog, Disney, Nickelodeon, the World Bank, and members of Congress. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and not have a mask on. It feels a little strange though. So what I thought I would do is, in my research, I study typically kids growing up in poverty and how we can harness educational media to support them. And when Amy contacted me, I decided to try something a little different with this talk. It's sort of an iteration of something I did a couple of years ago. So get started. I want you to take a second and imagine your 5-year-old self. Okay. And think about the things that you like to do, or if you remember the TV shows perhaps that you love to watch. If anybody wants to volunteer their TV show, that'd be great. Like, or a movie, could have been a movie.
The Land Before Time.
I
love that.
I think we own all, and there are 13, I think.
Oh my God.
Yes, they're all available on Purdue, by the way. My daughter, my now 24-year-old, that was her thing. And it was like a comfort object. Anybody else? Yeah.
Blue's Clues.
Oh, Blue's Clues. Yes, Blue's Clues is a great show. I've done work with Angela Santamero, who created Blue's Clues. She's lovely. She also created Super Y and Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. And she and I both have this tremendous love of Mr. Rogers. And so that's my memory. I used to go and he just made me feel really special. And I could do that. And my brother hated Mr. Rogers, so I could watch it without him around. So we often have these positive associations. My oldest son, who will be 29 in May, his favorite sort of movie TV show, well, TV show is Arthur, and so he was very disappointed that it went off the air this year, and Lion King. So I always loved the Lion King because it meant I got an extra hour and a half of sleep if we pop it in. Anyway, so we often have a lot of positive associations with media, regardless of what your family demographics look like. I like starting with this quote. We often have anxieties about new media. We tend to panic and think that it's going to be the end of the world. So this is a quote by Douglas Adams, who I was first introduced to in high school reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but he writes, everything that's already in the world when you're born is just normal. So this is, my 25-pound phone that if your finger slipped out of the dial, you had to restart everything. You probably don't remember those. And the boombox and Atari, etc. Anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative, and with any luck, you can make a career of it. So this is the computer that one person on my floor in college had, one. And it had those hard floppy drives. This is what email looked like initially. It was at the DOS prompt. This is called Pine, and this is my first email account at Kansas when I was a grad student. And I did not have a cell phone because they were stupid expensive until I was probably 24, and then I had the bag one that you put into the cigarette lighter in your car, but never used it because it was way too expensive. I remember being at Old Navy thinking, this person just called their house to ask what color t-shirt their daughter wants. What? That's so wasteful. Go figure. But after a certain age, anything that gets invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things and the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it, until it's been around for about 10 years when it gradually turns out to be all right, really. So I like to sort of contextualize media in this notion that when new media are available, we often have a moral panic. And that stems from this idea that it's important to understand how kids spend their free time. And this is the result of the rise of the child study movement that began in the late 1800s into the 1900s, which my kids are like, you're born in the 1900s. That's great. And so we often wanted to know what kids were doing with their leisure time because that mattered. We should know what they're doing and they should be spending it productively, which is not the case. They would go to films, the cinema, and the cinema was demonized in the same way that television or smartphones today are demonized. And the idea is really you need to figure out where it fits in the context of your life and what affordances it has. So my research program is a combination of basic research and applied research. And some places don't like the focus on applied research, but here at Purdue, I'm in human development, family studies, and a lot of people in that department do applied research. It doesn't mean it's any less rigorous. It just means for me, any research that I'm doing, I want to be useful and have sort of a practical application. So for me, the research to practice component is really important. In the kind of work that I do, I tend to look at learning and cognition and all of the various components of cognition. And with my colleague, Rachel Barr, we have developed a framework, I'll talk about it in a little bit, where we look at individual child factors, we look at content or stimulus attributes, and the context in which, I think I have that fast forward, whatever, the presentation mode on, the context in which the exposure occurs and how all of those ultimately influence learning. So back in 2001, I was a newly minted PhD doing a postdoc, and my graduate advisor wrote this quote. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could study it, but it's always been there. And in the last maybe 5 years, I've been trying to work with the idea. So he writes, the influence of an early condition intervention or other basis for predicting diverging individual differences over time will be greater if it produces differences opposite in direction from developmental changes expected normatively for that outcome. Conversely, if the antecedent produces differences favoring the developmental direction that you would normatively expect, its effects will be attenuated and harder to detect. So let me break that out a little bit for you. So if we're thinking about resiliency and what factors can promote development or inhibit development, from that body of literature on resiliency, because I study kids who are at risk, typically due to economic disadvantage, what we usually see is if you're low risk, you're likely to fall out somewhere here. Not a huge bump for any kind of resource that you get. But let's say these folks down here at the bottom who are high risk don't get the intervention. They're likely to be doing much more poorly than their more advantaged peers. And so that would be the first step in trying to think about how media might benefit certain kids. So you have this gap here, this achievement gap that I'm going to come back to repeatedly to talk about how difficult it is to bridge the achievement gap, but how media can actually do that. So this one is the same sort of idea, but now we're bringing those kids who are considered high risk up. They're not surpassing their peers, but we are closing that gap. However, it takes significant intervention typically to do that, because developmental trajectories tend to be established early and are pretty resistant to change. For instance, kids reading below grade level at the end of first grade, 88% of them are likely to be reading below grade level at the end of third grade. By age 3, kids who grew up in more advantaged households have vocabularies double the size of their peers growing up in poverty. So it's about 1,116 words to 525 words. And those gaps just continue to widen, even with significant intervention. But this idea of knocking you off your normative trajectory, when you have an intervention that does that, the effects will be particularly strong compared with kids who have similar demographic characteristics but don't receive the intervention, or those who are progressing normatively, let's say, toward positive academic achievement. So what we would expect here is these high-risk kids to actually outperform their more advantaged peers and close that gap. So I use 2 different theoretical perspectives to think about this. You may have heard of differential susceptibility. That's Jay Belsky's theory that children become more or less susceptible due to what's inside them. So individual difference factors, genetics, neurological issues, personality factors, and that you can be, if you are susceptible, that means you could really benefit, but conversely, you could really be impacted negatively. So it depends upon what that intervention is. And then Unger came along and talks about differential impact theory. And basically that is the environmental piece and how that relates to changes in individuals and thinking about how what's in the environment and the available resources can either inhibit or support development. So want to shift a little and give you some information on resiliency and that body of work, because I prefer to work from a strengths-based perspective than from a deficit perspective. So resilience, Sir Michael Rutter is an UK psychologist who, if you remember the Romanian orphans and that situation and how due to political efforts to increase the birth rate in Romania, there were taxes on if you had fewer than 5 kids, and there was no contraception allowed, and all of these kinds of things. And it led to like 300,000 kids being put into some kind of orphanage, and there weren't enough people to provide stimulation and support. So Sir Michael Rutter was someone who did research and tried to understand this. So he argues that resilience starts with the recognition that there's a lot of variation in the way people respond to the same experiences. And it's important to think about that and what implications that has. So in the field of media effects, sort of globally, they're fairly small. They're not very big effects, maybe accounting for 10 to 15% of the variance in some outcome. But when you start to look at individual differences or stimulus attributes or the context, you can identify kids where you're likely to have a big effect. So I like this quote, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And so the idea behind this is these kids who are growing up in under-resourced homes and facing adversity, if we can give them the tools that they need, they can deal with the adversities that they're faced with and go on to succeed. So resiliency in theory is you have this dynamic system or person, and to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten you, the ability to adapt is and overcome and actually succeed, not just overcome, but succeed in positive ways is sort of the foundation of resiliency. And then in practice, it's our capacity both alone and with groups to navigate our way to resources that will ultimately sustain our well-being. And how do we do that with kids, particularly in under-resourced homes who don't have access to materials or interactions? So we'll get to that. So how do educational media interventions become especially powerful for kids? So kids are more or less susceptible due to specific cultural, linguistic, family, societal, and media-related socialization experiences. So I want you to keep in mind as we look at these examples, susceptibility is not a single quality. So I'll show you some examples. You might be susceptible to some sorts of hazards and buffers and not others. You might be susceptible to some kinds of outcomes, but not others. And context is absolutely vital. So you might be susceptible at one period of time in your life and not another, which basically means you need to think about all the things that could happen and how they might affect all the kids in all the different ways, which makes things super complicated, but interesting. So in thinking of media, there's literature that it's a risk. There's literature that is protective. So on the risk side, there's been research that indicates early viewing is linked to language and attention problems. There's research that links playing video games, particularly violent video games, is associated with aggressive behavior and attention problems. And then there's really no research that backs this up. This is just from a book, but watching, I just love this line. TV leads to a semi-trance-like state dominated by alpha-type brainwaves, leading to a habit of neural passivity. So Jane Healy wrote this in response to, have you ever seen a child watching TV and they've kind of got that zombie-like look? That is actually a state of focused attention, and that's when they're learning the most. So you are not a passive creature to be filled up by watching the screen. You are actively working to process and understand. In fact, your ability to understand what's on the screen drives your attention versus the other way around. So if you don't understand what's on the screen, you'll look away. In terms of being a protective factor, watching educational TV is linked to higher grades and more book reading. Playing video games is linked to lower levels of hyperactivity and fewer attention problems. And Sesame Street is linked to stronger school readiness skills, less likely to be retained in grade, and going further educationally. So it can act in both ways. And why is that? A lot has to do with content. So in the early days of screen media research, it was all television, and people would look at total exposure to outcomes, and it would mask potential differences related to the content that you watch. So in 2001, with my grad advisors, we published a monograph to say, this is how important content is. And I'm going to show you some of that data in just a minute. And when you consider content, you see really variable effects depending on the content and the outcome that you're looking at. In addition to those explanations, different cultural, linguistic, family, and societal differences matter and can matter a lot. Using an ecological approach, which is basically nesting the child in the middle of progressively more distal influence, will give us clues as to who will be helped and who might be harmed via exposure. And then when you start to include all of these proximal and distal characteristics, the most susceptible kids tend to show the biggest gains. So this is the framework from all of that my colleague Rachel and I developed. Basically, you have micro level content attributes like Is it a narrative formatted TV show? Is it an expository formatted TV show? What kind of learning strategies are embedded in the show? How is the on-screen print positioned? Are the production techniques too much? Often the case for infants. And so those content attributes need to work with macro level contextual features. So what's going on in the family? Does the parent co-use media? What's going on in an early childcare situation? What's the parenting style that creates a certain kind of milieu in the family? And then you have to take into account a child's individual differences. Things like babies have cognitive constraints that make it really difficult to learn from screens or anything two-dimensional, books, screens, pictures. Gender actually makes a difference in here as well. So I want to start by talking about the primary population that almost all of my research is with, and sort of give you the context for what it's like to grow up poor in the United States, and then we'll talk about the possibilities. So now this data is from 2016. With the child tax credit, we lifted a bunch of people out of poverty, and then we took it away and they went back into poverty. So these numbers are probably a little bit low. So about 20%, 1 in 5 years children are living in poverty. Poverty rates had been increasing. They recently dropped slightly in 2019, and then they've gone back up. Younger children, especially those under the age of 6, are more likely to live in poverty, and also more likely to live with a single parent, usually a mother. Racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to live in poverty. So about more than 60% of Black, Hispanic, and American Indian children live in poverty during their lifetime compared to white children. And then kids who are living in poverty are exposed to more toxic stress. What comprises toxic stress? Food insecurity, abuse and neglect, limited educational resources, limited opportunity, higher rates of physical health problems, higher rates of infant mortality, greater exposure to family violence and household chaos, instability, and more than 50% of moms who are living in poverty have some form of maternal depression. So that is a really dismal picture. What do we know matters for learning? Well, the frequency with which kids engage in routine learning activities, shared book reading, oral storytelling, talking about numbers. Also, the quality of the parent-child interactions is really important. So are parents providing cognitive stimulation? Are they sensitive and responsive to their child's needs? And then the provision of age-appropriate learning materials, having books available in the home, having toys available. How far behind are low-income kids? Well, you can see if this is where they should be, those kids in the bottom 20% of income are doing substantially worse than their more advantaged peers. You can see here the average cognitive scores of preschoolers who are in that highest 20% are 60% higher, their scores, than those in the lowest. By 4, children who live below the poverty line are about 18 months behind. And that is substantial and very difficult to catch up. By age 10, those gaps are still there. By the time the kids are in 3rd grade or age 10, kids from middle income homes know about 12,000 words, and kids from low income homes know about 4,000 words. But there's possibility here as well. And often we get caught up in these metaphors or tropes about people or children who are growing up in poverty. And you can see it in the kinds of child and family policies we have in this country, where all of the programs that try to lift kids out of poverty are entitlement programs based on income requirements that put stigma on kids and families who are using those. In contrast, policies for people who are seniors are universal, right? So Social Security, Medicare, they don't have the same sort of stigma associated with them. So sort of giving you that context there. This is one of my favorite quotes. Keith Milkey was someone who worked at Sesame Workshop back in the day, and he wrote, for low-income families with low redundancy of educational opportunity, public media as a free and universal service can make not only a contribution, but an unduplicated one, meaning these kids are less likely to have resources in the home. So having PBS available and free can provide them with educational resources that they may not otherwise have had. In fact, when Joan Gans Cooney founded Sesame Street, one of the reasons that at the time, most kids shows were done in the suburbs, like set in the suburbs, or set in a room like Romper Room. Maybe you guys are so young, you won't know Romper Room. But the teacher would look through the little like mirror and say, I see Sammy and I see Billy, and but it was set in a classroom. So she purposely wanted to set Sesame Street in an urban location on a street because that would provide an opportunity for these kids to see themselves represented on screen. So what matters for all kids? And then we'll look at how this applies to kids growing up in poverty. So you need to have positive, nurturing relationships and social support. Your brain needs to be in good working order. You need multiple opportunities to learn. You need to feel competent, or that you have self-efficacy. I can do this. I feel like I can do this. You need to be able to regulate your emotions, regulate arousal, which is hard for preschoolers, right? I mean, it's hard for adults sometimes, but it's really hard for little kids. And you need to be able to regulate your behavior. If you're always impulsive and acting out in the classroom, what happens? The teacher labels you as a problem, and that label will stick. You also need to have a sense of belonging, whomever it happens to be with, one person or peers or whatever it happens to be. Emmy Werner did a study in Kauai where she found kids who were, despite these incredible adversities, were succeeding, and found that having certain protective factors or buffers made a profound impact on these kids. And they transcended all of these other kinds of boundaries or constraints for these kids. And it typically came down to having at least one adult in your life who cared about you. It doesn't have to be a parent. It could be a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle. It could be a coach, could be a teacher. Someone just took an interest. So in thinking about that and thinking about social justice, we know that children and families who are marginalized, who are economically under-resourced, they're typically dealing with poverty, racism, and you have this intersectionality of these forms of oppression that lead to experiencing trauma on a daily basis. And it ends up becoming part of these institutionalized forms of exclusion and dysfunction. I mean, think about the way that we talk about kids growing up in poverty. If you look at the history of the research, prior to folks moving into this space of resiliency, it was all about problems. Like, how can we fix all these problems with kids? And now there's a big focus, like Marty Seligman at Penn does positive psychology. And among adolescents, there's this whole movement called positive youth development. So it's really this focus on what does the kid have and how can we take what they have and best support them. So thinking about resilience, I want you to think about it not as an outcome, but as a process. And we'll talk about how there are several different mechanisms within this process that lead to stronger outcomes for these kids. So within a social justice framework, much of what defines these pathways is locally defined. So what does that mean? It means that maybe for this child or in this community, these are what or in this culture, even if we go out more broadly, that the culture defines what's important, and that may not be the same from place to place. And so it's important to think about that as you're thinking about how best to support kids. So things that we might think as middle class educated people, we might think they're problematic, may not actually be problematic. So there could be engaging in antisocial behavior like shoplifting because you want to eat would be an example of something that more educated people would say that's a problem, but actually that kid is being incredibly resourceful. So that's what I mean by we need to think about these things carefully and really focus on the strengths and the available resources, even if that means it's just a TV. So as I mentioned, prior to the resiliency movement, we often would ask these pathogenic questions about adversity or vulnerability and how that was negatively impacting kids. Sure, those are important questions, but they shortchange what we really need to do to facilitate change. So promoting change, you need to have social cohesion, you need to empower people and liberate people, and that is what is really important about social justice. So understanding vulnerability or understanding risk and adversity is important because we want to know what challenges these kids face. What is the history of that challenge? What's the context? But we need to remember there's more to somebody than just their challenges, right? So what do they have? We need to think about their coping resources. So often mothers who are experiencing postpartum depression will give their kids access to media as a coping tool for them. And if they're giving them access to high quality media, that can actually be really beneficial for the kids. We need to consider their strengths, and we need to consider attempts to deal with challenges. So I have another project working with disconnected youth. Those are 16 to 24-year-olds who are not in school and not employed. One of the things that many challenges, multiple challenges, they come in and out of these community organizations because they have so many challenges, but they're never refused, even if they dropped out a week ago. It's okay, you came back and you're still dealing with challenges, but look, you came back. And so that's how important it is to think about how they're trying to deal with the challenges. So when we focus on the agency of the individuals and personal responsibility without also considering more of these institutional level kinds of constraints, that's a problem. So you need to look at both. In the US, in general, we're a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of culture. Personal responsibility is really important, but that neglects all of what structurally could be changed to support families. So in thinking of resiliency as a process, you have these adversities that these children and families face. If we're thinking of it as a process, there are a bunch of mediating things, and I'm going to show you some examples from my research, how your preferences, your values, your use, and your competence at learning from can mediate the outcome. Familiarity and repetition, parent-child interactions and relationships, and representation on screen. So that's there if you want to look up the studies. Okay, so most of these examples focus on language and literacy because that's where most of my research has been. I also look at behavior problems. So we did a meta-analysis of studies that looked at educational television and vocabulary. So language, there are multiple different kinds of outcomes in language. In this particular study, we were trying to understand your expressive vocabulary, so that's what you actually produce, and your receptive vocabulary, that's what you actually understand. Receptive tends to be larger than expressive, particularly the younger you are. what we found is that when you split kids up by family socioeconomic status, the effect size for those who would be considered low income was 0.47. If you know what an effect size, a D, Cohen's D is, okay. So that's about moderately small effect size, whereas for middle income, and this is aggregated across a bunch of studies, it's 0.33, so it's lower. In a little bit, I'll show you the gap between middle and low income kids from some very large national studies of language and literacy skills, and then how educational media can change those things up. The first process that can mediate relationships is how much you value or prefer, or how much you use media, or how competent you feel at it. So in my research, we found that kids who are growing up in poverty and their parents use screen media a lot more. They also value that experience more. And as a result, they feel more competent when we've asked them about their learning. Like, could you learn from the television? Those who value it more and prefer it report that they feel more competent at learning new information, and as a result, learn more. So here on the right, that's not just limited to kids growing up in poverty. We also have found this gap is closing a bit now that they're creating content specifically for girls. But in our early work, we found an advantage for screen media interventions for boys. They seemed to prefer it. They had a greater affinity toward it. And so we were finding bigger gains for boys when compared with girls. Now, girls are progressing academically better than boys. School systems are set up to support girls more than it is not the best environment for boys. If you've ever seen the documentary Raising Cain, it talks about how school systems aren't typically set up well to accommodate boys. It's great. It's on PBS. I recommend it. So in a study we did this longitudinal study. Data were originally collected in the 80s. I did not collect that data. I was a child in the 80s, but my advisors did. And then we went back and recontacted them in the 90s when the kids were in high school. And so we had all that early viewing at 5, and most of the educational content was one of two things: Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers. Then we had their grades, as well as like aggression scores and creativity, a whole bunch of outcomes, but I'm just going to talk specifically about grades. And the grades were given to us from their transcripts. So it wasn't just, yeah, I got all A's. It was validated with transcripts. So this was with 570 teenagers out of 643. So we actually had, this was in the days before you could use the internet to stalk people and find them. So we would have to go to phone directories in libraries. Half of the sample was collected in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, the other half in Topeka, Kansas. So people moved all over the place. It's crazy. So what we found is that boys who watched Sesame Street, well, first let me show you, in 1990, the average high school GPA for boys was a 2.59, which is upsetting. The average for girls was a 2.77. So down here, those who didn't watch Sesame Street had a GPA of 2.32 for boys, 2.67 for girls. So the difference wasn't as substantial for the girls. And the more Sesame Street they watched, this is per week, the more Sesame Street they watched per week, the better the boys did. Now, if you think back to the statement I made, those boys aren't progressing normatively toward developmental outcomes around academic achievement. Usually they do more poorly. Girls are. So we can see Sesame Street didn't, it kind of bumped girls along, but the effect wasn't, it was attenuated because that's how they should be doing. Whereas for boys, you can see 2.86. That's pretty, you know, it's half of a GPA point higher if you watch 2.5 hours or more a week. So going back to content-based explanations, grades were only related to watching Sesame Street. We had all these creativity measures and like the extracurriculars that you did and the classes that you took, like were you doing art classes or music? And Mr. Rogers, viewing at age 5, predicted higher creativity scores and participation in creative activities. So further support for these content-based explanations. The next one is familiarity and repetition. So we know that kids growing up in poverty, or boys, and you know, as the previous example showed, often don't have these skills. And so they're really highly motivated by screen media. So could we use screen media to bring them along? And we have found that repeated exposure can make, so I've looked a lot at on-screen print. It can make that on-screen print accessible for the kids. And what you see here from, we did a study of Martha Speaks. I don't know if you know Martha Speaks. It's a book series that PBS turned into a show, and it focuses on vocabulary. And because vocabulary is so important for all of academics, especially reading. And this stands for working class and low socioeconomic status. And so one of the things that the Department of Education wanted done in this particular study was they wanted to know if they actually put the word on screen when that word was first introduced and defined, would that help kids more than not having print on screen? And so for those kids from low income homes, they didn't, overall, they didn't really benefit. They did more poorly with the on-screen print versus the working class kids. So this was a concern and something we had found previously in a study looking at Between the Lions. The most at-risk kids didn't show as much benefit. So this was concerning, like what's going on here? We had told the parents in this study, here are the DVDs for the whole first season. Keep track of watching it. We asked that your child watch at least once a day, but they like watched a ton and kept track of it. And what we found here is that it took a certain number of views before the kids who were from low income backgrounds started to benefit. It was right around 30, 31 episodes. So they had to watch the show 31 times to undo this here and show the benefit. Whereas the working class kids, the more they watched, the less sort of return on investment, because they had those skills to begin with. They had larger vocabularies and they were better readers. And so they may have stopped paying attention. They may have thought, I can do this, and not really invested in it. Whereas as the kids got exposed to print from the low income families, they became familiar enough to be able to use that. And we think having the words present acted as a cue to say, this is important to attend to. The third mediating process are parents and the relationships and interactions that you have. And one of the most interesting findings, because as most of the research on middle income families says book reading is vital. You should be reading to your kids every night from birth, or even before if you're being super crazy and believing educational toy creators, but that's another issue. So one of the things that we did is we asked parents, we created a scale that got at all the interactions that typically happen during a middle income parent-child book reading session and put those around screens and ask the questions, what is it like? Do you sit down and watch with your child? And what we found is, compared to working class and middle class parents, low income parents talked about media, talked about the motives of the characters, sat with their kids. It was an experience. It was a family experience. And as a result, the way that they talked about screen media was the same way that middle income parents talk about book reading. So this is a resource that we can tap into. And that, I don't have that data on here, but that goes on to lead to bigger gains if the parents did that more. This, so in another study with 1,500 families, it was a nationally representative sample. We asked parents about their parenting style and found that responsive and sensitive parents could buffer high risk, defined as living in poverty preschoolers who were spending more time with video games. Whereas low risk preschoolers, if their parents were more responsive and sensitive and they were spending a lot of time with video games, they did worse. They had more behavior problems. And the speculation is for those kids who are more at risk, spending less time with parents who may not be as responsive and sensitive is probably better. Whereas if they did have responsive and sensitive parents, they could see a bigger effect positively on their behavior. For those low risk preschoolers, though, it was the reverse. It was likely displacing all of these great interactions with their parents, and they were missing out and having more behavior problems. And we actually see the same thing with language in kids under 3. The fourth one is representation. So over the years, there have been numerous content analyses of kids' TV and primetime television, if you remember what that was back in the day. And you would see things like for every 3 male characters in lead positions to every 1 woman, or not seeing a lot of representation from kids from minority backgrounds. And that's a problem, because if you don't see yourself represented on the screen, or you don't see yourself, I can remember, as another example, as a kid, there weren't always toys in the store like there are year-round now. So it was usually around the holidays, and you would get presents for the holidays and your birthday, and that's it. And so around the holidays, we would go to Kmart, and I would look at the doll aisle, and all the dolls had blonde hair, and it would make me crazy because I just wanted a doll that looked like me, not a blonde-haired, blue-eyed doll. And so to take that a step further, if you look at the representation, even Sesame Street has a problem where they have more boy and male characters than they do female characters. They tried introducing a new female character. I don't know if you remember Zoe. She failed. Kids didn't like her. So they created Abby Cadabby, who was much more popular. And people gave them a lot of grief because Abby Cadabby was glittery and pink and purple. And their point about that was that's what preschoolers want, pink and purple sparkles. And we can take the opportunity to show her doing gender reversed kinds of behaviors, but we have to get them to come and see themselves represented. So seeing that leads to larger learning gains, and the mechanism is thought to be the formation of a parasocial relationship. So you identify with and like that on-screen character, and as a result, you pay more attention, you're more likely to learn from them. So I'm going to talk about a series of studies we did with Between the Lions. It debuted in 2000. I started working with them in 1999. I first want to show you, here is the, I don't know why my effect sizes are gone, but the achievement gap between low and middle income kids is about, I think it's around 0.6. in terms of a Cohen's d. So the first study that we did was just viewing in low and working class school districts. And what we found is just viewing the first 16 episodes, 1 per day over 4 weeks, bridged that gap. And the kids learned all of these code related skills. They didn't get a lot of comprehension or vocabulary from the show, but they did get like phonemic awareness, knowing the letters, the sounds of the letters, that kind of thing. So as a result of this study, they went back, and the first graders didn't learn as much. They went back and added first grade content to make it more accessible, and because they really wanted to bring in first grade boys who were struggling to read. So the next study they did, they decided we're going to make a curriculum and put it into preschools. So they did this. Now, Between the Lines is created by WGBH. I don't know if you know where that is. It's in Boston, big city, East Coast. The study was going to be done in Mississippi, in the Delta region, which is predominantly Black families, and on the Choctaw American Indian Reservation. So they made this pre-made curriculum, and they came down and they sort of showed it, and the people are like, it looks like some East Coast stuff. Like, what is that? It got even worse when we got to New Mexico doing the same thing. They referred to them as hoochie mamas. And so they gave them that, they gave them all the books, and they did training, but they didn't take into account that childcare teachers only had to have a high school diploma in Mississippi. So, you know, when you have over half of your childcare teachers who don't know what silent E is, that's a problem. Okay, so not very big effect. So they're like, okay, we gotta go back to the drawing board. So then they went down and they worked, go figure, with the families and the communities that they wanted to put this in place with. So they worked to select books and make it more culturally relevant, but they didn't help the teachers. So again, not much of an effect. So then they're like, hey, you know, we got the cultural piece, and we can see some changes in some of the qualitative interviews we did, but we're not seeing it on the standardized tests. So they said, we're going to do some mentoring with these teachers and help them learn. But it was limited. So they did a training session, and then they met like once each semester. So we're getting a little bigger. So then they said, all right, we got to go full in. We got to go in the classroom. We got to model what we're doing. We have to make it applicable to the teachers, to the parents, and to the kids. And when they did that, big effects. Exactly. So one of the things about this also is when they transitioned it to New Mexico, we worked on 11 different American Indian reservations, 9 Pueblo, Mescalero, Apache, and Navajo, which meant 11 different IRBs, 11 different permission letters. Like it was insane. But we did everything with the community. We revised everything. Every book that went along with this TV show in the classroom was written by an American Indian author. But the Hoochie Mama comment stood out when they were first showing the clips. And they said, we don't see our kids in any of this at all. And so they said, well, you're right, but we can't go shoot. We can't change any of these shows. And they said, but it's a problem because our kids aren't going to see themselves. So what they ended up doing was going out and shooting several bids on Taos and one of the Pueblos. And the kids got so excited to see someone like them on the screen. So you had that. You had these books written by American Indian authors, and you had all this mentoring, and you saw these huge effects. And so it really spoke to the power of representation and how important that would be. I guess I put percentages there. So across this body of work that we've done, here's the gap in effect sizes for income. Here's the minority gap. So you can see effect sizes. This is associated with language and literacy. So when it's just television only, the biggest effect you see here is with low income, also because they have the furthest to go. When you add classroom activities, it gets larger because you're giving them more access in multiple places. We do say longitudinal gains, and then when we add in a home piece with the parents, you also get big gains too. So why? Again, to revisit this, our media intervention is really powerful. To remind you, susceptibility is not a single quality. You could be susceptible to some hazards and buffers and not others, or some outcomes and not others, and context is important. So in the research that I presented, susceptibility was defined in multiple ways. It could be poverty status, gender, it could be the quality of parenting or minority status. You might be susceptible to some hazards and buffers and not others. Girls showed little bump with educational television, whereas high-risk kids, boys, and poor children showed quite large gains. You might be susceptible in some kinds of outcomes and not others. So boys had this effect with academic cognitive outcomes. What's interesting, I didn't present here, is in that same study, we had aggression and violent media, and we found that boys didn't really, I mean, it bumped them along to be more aggressive, but it wasn't significant. Girls, it was. So if girls were watching a lot of violent content when they were young, they were more likely, and the aggression measure was more of a verbal aggression and irritability and that kind of thing. So, and relational aggression, which is super fun if you've ever been to middle school. And then context is crucial. So you might be susceptible at one period in your life, but not another. And so what's really interesting is we found early viewing of educational media was a much stronger predictor of outcomes in high school than viewing educational content in high school. And the reason that we think that's the case is that we refer to it as the early learning hypothesis. It sets you up with this whole chain of because clearly watching Sesame Street as a 5-year-old does not relate in any shape or form to academic outcomes as a high schooler. But having a more positive attitude toward learning, feeling some success, you get labeled by your teacher in positive ways, you feel competent and successful, and that leads down the road. So going back to, if you remember what mattered for all kids in under-resourced homes, we know positive nurturing relationships and social support. So there is research that this formation of this parasocial relationship with on-screen characters enhances learning, and that's been down as young as 18 months. A human brain in good working order. So we know high quality educational experiences provide a lot of protection for your brain. You know, I grew up in poverty, and I spent a lot of time watching Mr. Rogers, and it felt like a safe space for me. And so it provided this relationship for me that I felt like he really cared because he was talking directly at me. Having opportunities to learn based on content, there, you know, if you're watching social studies content, social studies outcomes are higher. And you can see not only do you learn the content featured in the show, but it transfers. Then self-efficacy. So with media, you can scaffold and help kids build competence. So that, I'm glad you mentioned Blue's Clues, because that's how they do that show. It was originally designed to show the same episode 5 days in a row. And they layered in more difficult content in the game part. And if you've ever looked at like what's on the TV or what's on the wall in the back, all of those things relate to whatever the theme is. So you have to go back and watch and see that. So building that in, kids who watched that show multiple times actually became more engaged with it and learned substantially more. And then also, if you have this desire to use it, you prefer it, you value it, you have bigger learning gains. In terms of regulating your emotions, your arousal level and behavior, I didn't talk about this, but if you're watching educational media, you tend to have stronger executive function skills. So that's sort of your command and control center in your brain, especially those who are high risk. Then having a sense of belonging or meaning in life. Parasocial relationships again play a role here, being motivated, feeling that this content is useful, and then having involved parents. And I showed that low income parents interact with and around TV in the same way middle income do around books. So to recap, kids living in poverty have less access to traditional learning supports. Research suggests that screen media content is preferred, valued, and effective as learning supports for these kids. Competence at learning from and perceived usefulness provide an opportunity to start with those basic skills, motivate them, and be able to transition them to more difficult content. Once you establish this, you will not only do well from watching on the screen, but books become powerful for you then. And then the implications from all this, we should meet children where they are with the resources they have, prefer, and value. And that fits, I think, nicely within a social justice framework. All my students, and I always end with Mr. Rogers because he's my favorite. And then any questions? Hopefully I didn't go, I went too long, I think, didn't I? Sorry.